clerk will read out the names.
Very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us here on Parliament and Governance on Independent Television. We're in Benin City, Nigeria. I'm Uyi Agumofwegwe. Obviously, given the situation we're dealing with in this country as far as insecurity is concerned, we thought we should take out this week on the program to look at the dynamics of the implications of this situation that we're dealing with, what exactly government should do or probably is already doing to ensure that we deal with all of this ultimately. But more importantly, we're looking at how we can take advantage of the laws as they are today and maybe introduce more to ensure that we're able to run circles around all of these challenges. I mean, look at the trajectory, for example. You realize that the situation is fast spiraling out of control. So it now places so much of responsibility on the part of the authorities to ensure that they do as much as possible within the shortest possible time as well. So questions will be, for example, what exactly is the state of the laws now as it has to do with fighting or dealing with issues of insecurity, and what more can we do by way of legislation in particular to ensure that we find answers to these questions as quickly as possible. We'll find sense in all of this after this break. Stay with me. My guest today on the program is a brilliant lawyer who is interested in all of these issues that are around the insecurity in this country. Also wants to help us share insights as to what more, I mean, in addition to whatever efforts we have made so far, we can do by way of legislation to ensure that we also win this war against insurgency, banditry, kidnapping, and all other forms of criminality in this country. Barrister Daze Wanta, thank you for coming on the program. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again.
I would like to start this conversation from that point when we started having governors in this country who came up and said they were legislating in such a way that they could criminalize kidnapping, you know, in a different manner. Some of them came up and said, okay, we're introducing a piece of legislation in such a way that if somebody is arrested for and convicted for kidnapping, for example, the house where they took their victims to, for instance, will be confiscated. They will have to spend the rest of their lives in jail. And then you have other states that said, well, if such a person is convicted, ultimately, they would have to pay the ultimate price for it, and so on and so forth. I want you to talk to me about the importance of legislation in dealing with criminality.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think beyond kidnapping, we've always had other crimes which touch on our security as a state, right, and even at the national level as a nation. And you find that lately we've always had this problem of course, the Boko Haram insurgency is there, banditry, you know, this new wave of killer Fulani headsmen. And, you know, initially it started off up in the north, but now it has moved down south. You know, places like Oyo, which now made the governors of the southwest to ban open grazing, especially night grazing. Right. And even more than that, a state like Ondo, the governor said all the Fulani headsmen should leave the state. And of course, you know, that thing created some form of crisis where even we had governors, you know, having brickbats.
And he said those interested should come and register formally.
Of course. So I think the issue of security is something that at the moment in the country, it's of topmost priority. You see that even states are now bridging up with all manners of legislation. You know, you have anti-open grazing legislation, which most states have legislated upon. And even in Edo, we've even had a situation where the governor had to ban night grazing. And he didn't just stop there. He took further steps in setting up 7-man committees across, a 7-man committee across the 18 local governments. And also banned the use of firearms by these Fulani people, because the time has come for government to be more proactive. And the basis for which government can act is when you have an existing legal framework. You know, you mentioned kidnapping.
Right.
Even at the level of Edo, just like in other states. Anti-kidnapping law was amended sometime in 2013, which now places death penalty on kidnappers. So for me, I think legislation has a very big role to play in all of this. And you even made the reference to the fact that the property in which some of these kidnappers operate from should be confiscated. But when you look at what the Edo law says, it's clear that once your property or your premises is used by any kidnapper or suspected kidnapper, such a property will be demolished. I remember in 2013 or 2014 thereabout, Adams Oshiomhole as governor demolished, a story building at Hartford Flats because some kidnappers were actually found there, and that place was identified as a hideout. So I think legislation has a very big role to play. And of course, there should be some form of synergy between the legislative bodies, that's the State House of Assembly at the state level and the National Assembly, and the executive.
I want us to look at legislation from the federal perspective. I mean, the joint houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. There are those who are now saying that the National Assembly, as we know it, is not doing enough, given the intensity of the impact of criminality that we have come to find in this country in very recent times. Do you share that sentiment that the National Assembly has way more to do than they have already done right now?
I think yes, because you find that at the national level, we don't have a central legislation, right, that deals with this issue of this farmer headers conflict. Because if there is a national legislation, because we have national laws on, like you talk of this problem of terrorism. In 2011, there was the first law, that prohibited terrorism, placed certain, penalties, and there was an amendment in 2013. So we expect to find the same legislation in this Fulani herdsmen. I won't just want to classify, the headers as Fulani because it is not fair.
Of course.
To, let's just say, killer herdsmen.
Wherever they come from.
We don't really care because you can find them from places like Niger, Chad, and a day will come where we'll find that our local people may now choose this as a way of life because kidnapping was not tied to any tribe, but today it's now a national problem. Assuming we now have other tribes involved, so it would be wrong to label those killer headsmen as Fulani, though we know that the majority of them are Fulani people. So these killer headsmen, we need a national legislation to curb the menace, not just for states, because now you find that some states will talk about land grazing, some will talk about anti-open grazing, some will talk about the use of firearms. So, but I think there is need for the National Assembly to step in by having a national legislation that states that don't have that, law banning open grazing can at least draw a cue from it. And in such laws, there is need to create alternatives. So before now, we used to have grazing routes. Are we now going to outline these new grazing routes or redefine the grazing routes in this legislation? Are we going to now allow for ranching? Because in places like California, Arizona, Texas, where you have people going into pastoralism, keeping cows and feeding them, there's room for at commercial level there's room for ranching. It's a business, it's a purely commercial venture. So I think there's need for the National Assembly to step in because this security challenge of Fulani herdsmen killing people or these killer herdsmen killing people is a huge national menace. Just in 2018 alone, over 100 persons were killed. The national population is depleting. So it constitutes a clear and present danger, and there's need for urgent legislative intervention by the National Assembly.
It's a beautiful thing that you are a lawyer. There are those now, I don't know how outrageous or, interested in this may seem, but there are those now talking about the animal rights. All right, but in Nigeria, we're saying, look, human life comes first.
True.
It's not negotiable.
True.
But there are people now saying, well, animals have rights, of course. They can use the road. In recent times, we're seeing instances where vehicles rammed into cows or cows rammed into vehicles, whichever. But we've seen collision time and again in this country. Isn't it indicative of our inability to enforce the law as it stands today?
Because when you look at our constitution, it does not create any special category. What we have is human rights. It's not like the fella, phraseology, animal one talk of human rights. No, we are talking of the life of individuals here. Because the Constitution talks about every citizen. And in terms of protection, under Section 14, sub 1, 2b, that talks about the security and welfare of the people is the primary purpose of government. It does not talk about the security and welfare of cattle, right? of cows or any animals for that, I mean, it's wrong for us to put the interest of animals way above that of human beings. And again, when you look at the farmers, it is their economic rights protected under the Constitution.
Right.
But it is now wrong when you now find these, headers go into their farms, destroy their, food crops, and in some cases even kill these farmers. It will have a very serious toll on our economy. So I think it's a very serious matter. The interests of Nigerians must be considered first, and there's need for government at the national level to have an open policy and legislate on this issue once and for all, so that we know that in so and so place you have ranches, right? So that we don't just have cows move freely,
Yes.
as if they are having their own kind of Olympics.
I'm going to ask you just one question before we hit a break at this point. We've talked about legislation about this, legislation about that, but it appears the conversation has not been expanded enough to cover or cater to issues that have to do with compensation for victims of killer herdsmen, for example, whether for their farm produce or for the lives they've had to lose and, of course, injuries that they've suffered on account of this menace.
I think we don't need to wait till when we have such a legislation.
Okay.
But as an interim measure, and I think some state governments, of course, have done that, I mean, in time past, and are still doing that, when you find that, a family is bereaved, of course, it's mostly the breadwinner, the farmer, that is attacked. So government should provide some form of palliative. I mean, for the children of such persons that were murdered by these killer herdsmen, we provide scholarship and even a source of livelihood for such families. And to a very large extent, I think legislation will cure this problem. So that in that particular law, there should be a clause for compensation. Very important, for compensation.
Okay, we're just going to hit a break quickly now. We're looking at how legislation in Nigeria can help answer many of the nagging questions that Nigerians are asking regarding the challenge of insecurity that we're dealing with in this country at this point. We're back shortly to expand the talking points. Stay with me.
Part of the problem that we're experiencing today is that there's a lot of pressure on law enforcement generally because of the different expressions of dissent and the different expressions, in some cases insurgency, in some cases skirmishes as you've described. So there's a lot of pressure on law enforcement generally. And people do have a right to sometimes be offended by things, be up in arms and all of that. What we need to do is to quickly deal with those issues, to quickly try and see how we can resolve those issues. In many cases, it's not easy to resolve them. In many cases, I mean, look at the Southern Kaduna problem. That's been on for years and years and years. Even today, all the parties that I met admitted that what we're even experiencing now is a shadow of what has happened in the past. Hundreds of people have been killed in this process, in a lot of these conflicts over the years. But what we want to do is to see how we can resolve these problems, trying to see that justice is done. I think that what tends to happen in the past is that we just paper over issues. We just say, okay, everybody calm down. Let's see what we can do about this. Let's just calm down. And then we don't resolve the fundamental issues. But what we're trying to do is to look at what exactly the root causes of these problems are and try to resolve them. And that's why in this particular process, I've met with them twice now, where I'm going to meet with them individually again before we come back to meet, that's to say, meet with both groups individually again, before we come back to take a look at what the issues are. And we're trying to go through a deliberate process, and for the first time, government is involved at the level of the presidency. We're not leaving the matter to be negotiated at a lower level. And so there's a measure of authority that is coming into it, a measure of commitment from the government that's coming into it. And that's the same thing we're doing in the Niger Delta as well. We're trying to ensure that we deal with people, we look at the issues. I mean, a lot of these issues are issues of justice. A lot of people feel that they've been hard done by the government. People feel that their resources, and they're not enjoying their resources. In many cases, people feel that even their own leadership have dealt them a poor hand. So it's the sort of thing that we have to, you have to listen to the people. You have to understand what they're saying, and then try and resolve these issues, step by step. And it's a tortuous process. It's a very difficult process. In many cases, they are just law enforcement concerns. Kidnapping, some people doing some crazy things somewhere. But we are trying to respond to that by beefing up our law enforcement capacity. Unfortunately, we have not equipped our police and military well enough.
Thank you for staying with us on the program. This week I've been talking with Adazaya Mata. He's a lawyer and a public affairs commentator. I need to talk to you about this very quickly. We've seen a lot happen in other issues, I mean, that don't even have to do with insecurity, for example. And people say any issue that has political interference, as we seem to be seeing now with the issue of insecurity, becomes very difficult for you to deal with. Because at that point, legislation may not answer the question anymore. Do you think, from your standpoint, that we have over-politicized insecurity in this country?
I think yes, because there's this tendency of when issues like this come up, the various ethno-religious group will now want to make a statement. Because the feeling is because majority of the people who get themselves into this pastoralism, I mean moving animals from one place to the other in search of pasture, are Fulanis. So there's a tendency of members of that ethnic group to protect their own, not minding the criminality or criminalities involved. Right. So and I think that is not a very good way to approach this issue, because what is wrong is wrong. It does not matter where the person comes from. And I think we have a weak leadership at the central level, I mean the level of the federal government, because at this level we have a serious security challenge. We don't need to bring in any ethnic or religious consideration into this matter. We have to come together as a people, because we are all Nigerians. We are first and foremost Nigerians. Right. And it's a Nigerian problem, whether we like it or not. It's having a serious toll on the economy. So I think bringing politics into this will do nobody no good. And I think also this issue of state police, the time is ripe for us to have state police. I think the reason why we have this argument for and against is that we have not been able to appreciate its importance. Countries like America, you have state police there. But the problem has always been this fear of abuse. The question is, as it stands now, the Nigerian police force, which is a central police force, it's still open to abuses. But the most important thing is the security challenges we face. So in tackling it, yes, though we have states in the southwest that have come up with their own Amotekum, even in those states, we have our own community policing, the new constables that were recruited. But I think the time has come for the 1999 Constitution to be amended to take away the issue of security and policing from the exclusive list and put it in a concurrent list.
Some people say that's going to be an uphill task.
You talked about the role of the National Assembly.
Right.
This is another role they can play. The time has come, because if we make security a federal matter, the question is we have a federal system of government. It's not a judicial system we're operating here. The problem does not even affect those in Abuja. It affects people across the 36 states. So there's need to fortify the hands of the various state governors. You don't just call them chief security officer without giving them the legal wherewithal, the statutory backing. So I think the time has come for us to take away this issue of policing and security from the exclusive list and bring it down to the concurrent list, so that it will allow the House of Assembly to legislate on security matters. If
you look at Nigeria today, there's hardly a state that has not had its own relative fair share of insecurity. But then again, you have states that are essentially in the spotlight. I mean, look at the northwestern part of the country now. You see states like Kaduna, you see states like Katsina, and then, of course, you see Zamfara in particular. These are all states that have become spotlights for insecurity. You move down southwest, for example, you see a state like Oyo, for instance. Some people are now saying it's time the president declared state of emergency in some of these states. But then again, it's a tightrope to walk. What does the Constitution provide for as far as declaring state of emergency is concerned?
Of course, Section 305 provides for that. But in time past, we've seen cases of abuse. Like in the time of Obasanjo, in declaring the state of emergency in Plateau State, they suspended the governor.
So did they get the right foot there?
I mean, politics would naturally come in.
Okay.
A case where you have an APC federal government, you go to a place like Oyo where you have a PDP governor. Declaring the state of emergency in a place like Oyo would be seen as politics.
It's purely a matter of national interest.
Matter of national interest when, as a federal government, whenever you have a crisis situation, you ensure you mobilize the security forces, irrespective of the ethnic and composition of the persons involved. We know how this matter can be resolved. Until we deal with this issue from its root causes, or the root cause, we will just keep rigmaroling. First, this issue of community policing, by ensuring that the state governors are empowered by law to have their own security architecture. We're having a system where a governor will not have to rush to Abuja to see an inspector general of police to deal with security challenges in the state. I don't think that is right. As chief security officer, you should have the statutory backing, like in America. And that's why their system is working. It's not just for us to copy. If we are copying, we should copy properly. Because we look at the 36 states and ask ourselves, do we have security laws? The answer is no. Why? Because the federal government has that exclusive power to legislate on policing and security.
When the issue of Amotekun came up, the federal government, particularly through the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation,
yes,
bickered back and forth with not just the Oyo State government, but states around the southwestern parts, yes, of the country. Some people are now saying that that is a litmus test for whether or not we can have state police in this country, because the federal government at that point said that the law didn't provide for states to have their own security outfits. How much of work or headwind are we dealing with here?
I think it was trying to use a different name in achieving a purpose.
Okay.
Oh, you say Amotekun. Across the 6 states of the Southwest, they have already started state policing. It's just that they needed that constitutional backing to now call it what it is.
All right.
You are now using a tribal description for what has a name in English. So to that extent, in practice, we have state police,
okay,
or community policing, if you will. But what we just need is that backing, so that monies can be properly appropriated, so that tomorrow nobody will just come up and say, oh, Amotekun is unconstitutional, or what we are doing in Edo is unconstitutional. It is an administrative arrangement with the Inspector General of Police, because they have come to also accept, the federal government, that we have a very serious problem in our hands. No serious investor will come from abroad to invest when there's insecurity. In Edo State, if not for the fact that the governor had to quickly nip the problem in the bud, you remember there was a time in Benin when people could not go out as early as 7 p.m. So it's a very serious problem. Even across the various local governments, we had incidents of people being killed in their farms by these killer herdsmen. So I think the issue of security is something that must not be politicized, one. And two, there's an urgent need for very effective legislation. And it begins with the amendment of the Constitution to bring police within the concurrent list, not leaving it in an exclusive list that the federal government has not been able to handle this issue very effectively. It requires a lot of collaboration.
Just before I let you go, just one more question. There are people now calling for an overhaul of the Constitution. In fact, they are calling for a fresh Constitution. Respected senior lawyer Femi Falana, SAN, is one of those. Bakoba SAN is another. These are people now calling. In fact, including a political economist, Pat Utomi, now saying we should have a constitution that is more people-oriented. Would that be the magic wand to solve security problems in this country?
I think with the various alterations that have been made, to the Constitution, like America, they started off with the Constitution and they have many amendments to their Constitution.
Over time.
Yes, over time. To now make it what could be seen to be the people's Constitution. Because it started off with the Federalist paper. It is not something that is cast in stone. Right? It should be a work in progress. But the truth is, when we have people that lack the political will, right, it becomes a problem that will take a very long time. So I don't think it's possible for us. What now happens to the existing constitution? Right. If you now say you want it, it's not possible to achieve that brand new constitution of maybe a national conference. What happens to our National Assembly? And the National Assembly have always argued that for you to talk of a sovereign national conference, it means you have to first and foremost dissolve the existing National Assembly. Right. To solve this problem, we must appreciate one fact, that it is not a government that gives the people the constitution, but it is a constitution that gives the people a government. So to that extent, there's need for continuous overhaul of the existing legal architecture which the military gave us. Remember, it started off as a decree,
of course,
in 1998. So over time, we've had several alterations which the National Assembly has done. So I think, in meeting with the demands of Section 14 that places its duty of security and welfare as the primary purpose of government, there's need for the National Assembly, without delay, to amend the Constitution, taking away the issue of police and security from the exclusive list.
And bringing it to the
concurrent list, to allow states to have a role in all of this.
Okay, we hope that happens as quickly as possible, even though obviously it's already a tall order to accomplish. Thank you so much, Barrister Adazemata.
Always a pleasure to
for
be
coming
here.
to share with us on the program this week. That's what we're living it on Parliament and Governance. Thank you everyone for watching. I'm Uyi Agumofwegwe. Our coverage on ITV continues. Enjoy the rest of your evening.